As you know, you came to see a presentation by Kurt McLeod, the Vice President of PACT in Asia and Eurasia. He's going to be focusing on community forestry approach to REDD, the reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation in Cambodia. And introducing him is Paul Coles, PACT Senior Natural Resource Manager, or Advisor rather, out of Seattle, or was it?
Yes.
Out of Seattle, okay. Thanks, Paul.
Welcome, everybody. PACT is an international development NGO. Been around for about 30 years now, 40 years now. We really focus on helping people to respond to the difficulties in their lives. We have programs in natural resource management, we have programs in health, we have programs in livelihoods, and we have programs in democracy and governance around the world. We take a real capacity building sort of approach to helping people sort of respond based on their needs and desires to the difficulties that they're facing. To that end, Kurt is our Associate Vice President for Asia and Eurasia. He's been based in Asia for 17 years now, and a long-time PACT employee. And he's going to talk to us today about this program that's been going on in Cambodia for some time now, which takes a community forestry sort of approach to implementing a REDD project, reduced emission from deforestation and degradation. And so I won't speak anymore. I'll just turn it over to Kurt.
Thank you, Paul. I'm going to make a couple of assumptions here. And one of my assumptions is that you know what REDD is. And so this is not going to be a REDD 101 for those of you that are trying to understand REDD, because I think there's a lot of opportunities in Washington for you to get that information. And there's a lot of brown bags that deal with that REDD 101. I'm going to try to get technical and get under the hood of REDD as much as possible. That said, for those of you that are trying to catch up to speed, I do have a little bit of some background on REDD, which might help you. All right, what this presentation is all about is the role of community forestry specifically in relation to REDD. Looking at PACT's mission, it's all about communities. We love trees, yes, but I'm from probably a bunch of foresters. We love trees, but the trees exist partly because people are there. And either they're going to chop them down or they're going to keep them. And that's where we see community forestry and the community forestry approach to REDD as being critical. So I'll go through community forestry in general, globally. I'm going to quickly dip down into what does the compliance and the voluntary carbon market look like, and why is that important to community forestry as well as to REDD. And then we're going to get granular, get a little dirt under our fingernails, and we're going to go actually to Cambodia, and I'll introduce a case of a REDD project and what it looks like to be a community forestry REDD project in Cambodia specifically. Lastly, if we get to it, I will talk a little bit about what are some of the challenges regarding community forestry and REDD and some of the market opportunities. I'd also like to introduce one of my colleagues, Amanda Bradley, and she is the director of our Community Forestry Partnership Program in Cambodia. So she's the one with dirt under her fingernails. I'm about 1,000 feet above that one. So welcome, Amanda. Oh, sorry. All right. You probably have seen some of these statistics before. I think they're pretty phenomenal. There's 20% of the world's carbon emissions, more or less well debated, that come from deforestation. So what? What does that mean for communities? Well, if you look at the relationship between communities and forestry, 20% of the world depends directly on forests for livelihoods, and if you dig down deeper into that, this happens to be some of the most marginalized and poorest people in the world. Interesting to note that there is more than 25% of forest resources in developing countries that are actually managed by communities. So suddenly you start to see the weaving of a web that there is a direct connection between carbon emissions and the ability, or communities at the local level that are managing those carbon resources. That's why PACT has decided that our approach to REDD will put communities smack in the middle of REDD, and at all different levels, as you'll see later. And that community forests, as managed by local people, play that vector role for us. I'm not going to go into where REDD comes from, but what is important is that REDD has the potential to provide necessary incentives for community forest members to be able to sustainably manage their forestry resources. What's interesting here, again, forest resources are dramatically decreasing in Southeast Asia. It gives you an idea as to how many forest-dependent people there are just within Philippines, Indonesia, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Thailand. So that's looking at Southeast Asia, 140 million people. Again, I talked about already the importance of community forests. What's interesting is to note that in the Philippines and Vietnam, you have 37% in the Philippines and 12% of state forests that are currently managed by communities. That's a pretty high percentage. You'll see some other percentages as I go through this. When you talk about community forests and you talk about REDD, what's extremely important is land tenure. And that really sits smack in the middle, I think, of the relationship between community forests and REDD. And if we can't manage land tenure, or there aren't mechanisms for managing land tenure at the country level, then REDD will not be able to work through a community forestry mechanism. What I have here is a whole bunch, several different countries, and what are their current on the books land tenure rights for communities. So Indonesia gives the rights to up to 25 years for a community, if they're organized and they're registered, to be able to sustainably manage forest resources, state forest resources that are defined through that legislation. Cambodia has a 15-year land tenure for community forests. Thailand, still working on it. Philippines, 25 years. Interestingly enough, in China, believe it or not, 58% of state forest resources are actually owned by communities or owned by collectives. Who would go to figure in China that that's the case? And they also have one of the most progressive legislations throughout the world, which allows for, except for, somebody was saying there's a legislation that's more than 70 years, but in China it's 70 years where communities can have access to, and legal access to, community or state forest resources and managing them. However, when you actually go to apply in China, it really ends up being 40. Still, that's still a lot of years for communities. One thing that I think is interesting about this is looking at comparing forest tenure across regions. Global, Latin America, Asia, Africa. Here green is forests that are administered by government. Your blue in the middle here, this is owned by communities and indigenous people, so that's your potential area for community forests. You have your black, which is designated for use, so that is also potential for community forests. And then you have owned by individuals and firms, which is your purple down here. One thing that's really striking to me in this particular, these pie charts, is look at Africa. Africa has very little opportunity for community forests. And I would go so far to say that some of the conflict that is happening in Africa is resting right here, where communities actually do not have access to critical livelihood resources, which would be being able to manage some of the forests So I'm not making a statement that state can't manage forests. State can manage forests, and they can sometimes manage forests better than communities. But I think a diversified approach is a better approach than a mono approach, which is what you see in Africa. Hopefully that will change over time. Asia is not bad. Latin America clearly is the front runner in terms of providing rights for local communities to be able to manage forest resources. Land tenure and who has the right to sell carbon can have a direct effect as to how much investment is going into a carbon market in a country. I've given you two examples here where you have two very different land right regimes regarding REDD and selling of carbon. So in Indonesia, if you would like to get communities to have the right to sell carbon, you can actually set up a local entity. It has to be an Indonesian registered entity. They can then apply for a land concession. In this case, it would be a REDD land concession. The state would then sign a lease over to or a concession over to that entity, and that entity would then become the seller of carbon. Okay? Look at Cambodia, very different model in terms of who is the seller of carbon. In the case of Cambodia, the government does not provide land concessions for REDD. They provide it for all sorts of other things, agriculture, industry, etc. What they don't provide it for is for REDD. And so the government is the sole seller of carbon in that case. In Indonesia, it can be a private sector entity. In Cambodia, it is only the government. Now it might change, we don't know, but these are two different structures. I will say, if you look at investment in terms of REDD in both of these countries, Indonesia has a flood of investment going into the country, whether that be bilateral, multilateral, or private sector. There's all sorts of reasons for that. There's huge carbon resources in Indonesia because of peat. But there is also, I think, a more attractive investment environment in Indonesia because an investor could have a land concession for REDD. Whereas in Cambodia, you have to go through the government. The government will be the seller of the carbon. It changes I believe, the investment environment regarding REDD globally. All right, I'm not going to go through where the carbon market came from. What I do want to, this is just background stuff. Like I said, I don't want to get under the hood. What I do want to talk about is what's the growth of the carbon market over time, because it's grown significantly. If you look at 2004, the carbon market in total, this is the compliance market and the voluntary market, was up to $1 billion. By the end of this past year, it had increased to $150 billion. That's in a very short period of time. You see a new industry, actually, and I like to think of it as an industry, even though I come from the nonprofit sector. This is a new industry that we see evolving and growing right before our eyes. Some of the major private sector players, these are the ones that I know in Asia that are coming to the table in terms of investments and actually doing some of the project development costs or providing project development costs regarding REDD is Deloitte, Deutsche Bank, McGuire Investments out of Australia, Bank of America, Rio Tinto, and the list can go on. I have to get through this piece. So those of you who know the difference between the compliance and the voluntary market, it's important to be patient. It's important to note that REDD currently falls underneath the voluntary market and not the compliance market. So if I'm a company in the EU where I have restrictions as to how much emissions that I can have within my certain industry, I'm going to have to go outside, and I'm emitting more than that. I have to go outside to actually offset my carbon emissions. I can do that through the compliance market. And that will be a legal market through which I can prove that I am actually offsetting my emissions. I cannot do that through the voluntary market, or I can't do it as flexibly as one can or through the compliance market. Right now, REDD sits underneath the voluntary market. That obviously means there's also a different level of investment coming into the compliance market versus the voluntary market. Compliance market, people have to actually buy from that market. The voluntary market, people buy from the voluntary market for other reasons than compliance. They might be, one, hedging on their future, saying if I lock in today, a cheap price for carbon, I know in the future I might have to use it, and so therefore I want to collect all this carbon as much as possible because it will be cheaper for me to be compliant in the future when I'm forced to be compliant. That's the US. And then there's all sorts of corporate social responsibility reasons why people are coming into the voluntary market. Let me dip down into the voluntary market. This is REDD. It's not only REDD. The voluntary market does not just include REDD. It can include any carbon offsetting project. But within the voluntary market, it's a much smaller portion of the total market. It's only 2% of the total carbon market. It has grown significantly, though. You can see it's doubled between 2007 and 2008 in terms of the metric millions of tons that it is been sold on the market, as well as the value of that. What's important is that within the voluntary market, the prices fluctuate dramatically, and it's because it's not regulated. And so the deal for the carbon is made between the buyer and the seller, which means the buyer and the seller just decide what the price is. So I've seen it go from 50 cents, as much as low as 50 cents per metric ton, to up to $25 per metric ton. Now that's a huge difference, because let's imagine you have 7 million metric tons of carbon, that are coming out of a community forest. 50 cents times by 7 million versus 25 by 7 million. That has obviously a huge range in terms of how much financial resources are actually going back to the local level to address local level development issues, or to address sustainable management, forestry management from the community, by the community forests. Voluntary market, interesting to note, this is a pie chart that shows where the major voluntary market is right now, or where the registered projects are under the VCS for the voluntary market. It's mostly in the BRIC countries. It's in Brazil, it's in China, and it's in India. Again, most of this in the voluntary market, what this indicates is it's not REDD. It's something other than REDD. It's not forestry projects. It might be a cement plant, or it might be micro hydropower. It could be biogas. So most of the voluntary market right now is not made up of forestry projects. This is what it's made up of currently: wind, hydropower, fuel switch, and waste handling disposal. Look where forestry is currently regarding the voluntary markets. It's way down here. It's a very small percentage of the forestry market. Now, there's all sorts of modeling that's been done to see where it is, the voluntary market, going in terms of forestry. That's what this slide is about. If you look at reduced deforestation, this is projections for 2030. Caveat here is, good luck on your crystal ball modeling. But I think what's important here is looking at trends, not the amount and whether that amount is right or not, but it's showing a significant trend. Whether it's more or less to be seen. But by 2030, there's a huge percentage of the carbon market which will be coming from reduced deforestation, according to the study. Again, the trend is important, looking at where it is and where it will be. All right, we're going to get granular. We're going to get some dirt under our fingernails. This is a very specific project within a specific country context. Please keep that in mind. Don't generalize on REDD. Every country I go to and I look at a REDD, it's got a slightly different methodology. It's got a different enabling environment. There are different procedures and policies. So that changes the way REDD looks at the local level. So this has to do with a very specific environment, which is a political, social, cultural environment, which is in Cambodia. So I'm going to pass it off to Amanda. She's going to go through the project that she's involved in.
Okay, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. I've been in Cambodia for 12 years and just back here for the week, so I'm glad you can all join. In Cambodia, as Kurt said, it's a special situation. I think the forestry sector has changed a lot over the past decade or so. But there's still quite a lot of forest remaining, about 59% forest cover, which is relatively high in the region. But in terms of progress towards development goals, it's been limited. The rural population, which is about 80% of the population, is still living in below adequate living standards. But on the other hand, Cambodia has made a lot of progress towards REDD, setting up a framework and becoming what they call REDD. They've instituted a ban on logging, which has changed the sector quite a bit. You don't see the huge logging trucks passing down the road anymore.
Qualification. You still see huge logging trucks going down the road. It's just less. It's just less. There is illegal logging going on in Cambodia. It's a very corrupt country, but the logging ban has reduced that significantly. Just want to be honest.
The legal framework is now in place for community forestry, which has been a great achievement of a lot of different partners. There's now a community forestry sub-decree and the guidelines which allow the communities to get those 15-year rights, which you mentioned. The Forestry Administration has been designated as the seller of carbon credits, as Kurt pointed out, also differentiating the structure from that of Indonesia and mostly other countries. So we work very closely with the Forestry Administration. Other kind of more higher level achievements, joining the FCPF and becoming a UN REDD country. Also Cambodia has a goal of expanding community forestry from its current reach of about 150,000 hectares to 2 million hectares. So the government is pushing this and looking for more support to expand community forestry, which could really be the basis for expanding REDD as well. So in the project we've been working on in Oter Minche, it's in the northwest of Cambodia, next to the Thai border. It's one of the more remote provinces, which until a few years ago was very difficult to even reach because of the access roads and the security situation. It's a former stronghold of the Khmer Rouge. But it's also an area where the management of the forest has been quite strong by local communities, and these red areas here show the 13 community forestry groups that we're working with, and they're managing 68,000 hectares of forest, which when we were starting out looked like the kind of minimum amount of area that you would need for a REDD project to make sense. So at first it looked like it's impossible to do a REDD project with just a CF area, but this idea of bundling sites together can be very cost effective. So we're working with more than 10,000 households, and the project has already been submitted to the CCB, the Climate Community Biodiversity Standards, since last October, and we're just finalizing now for the voluntary carbon standard. I think Kurt's going to talk a bit more about those standards. The project is estimated to generate 7.1 million metric tons of carbon over 30 years, generating approximately $1 million a year. This ebbs and flows with the level of revenues, but this amount of revenue and net income to the local communities could have a very significant impact on their ability to protect the forest and to improve their livelihoods. So these steps, which Kurt has helped to outline, basically describe the process that we followed in our project. So we were first identifying these community forestry sites, deciding which sites in the country would be the best areas for this project, and figuring out what sort of overlaps with the other land use there were, such as a lot of sugarcane, biofuel concessions were coming in at that time, so we had some conflict dispute issues over the land. But now, as it stands, 11 of the 13 sites have gotten their legal agreements, and the final 2 should be processed very soon.
Remember, I talked about land tenure being extremely important to REDD, and what we're finding, not just in Cambodia, but we're finding throughout the world, is there's all sorts of developing world, there's all sorts of ministries that can sign an agreement with all sorts of different types of entities. So there's these overlapping land concessions on top of each other, not just for what's on top of the soil and above the soil, but also what's underneath the soil. So you might have the Ministry of Mining that's signing, a concession with a mining company. You've got an agriculture concession with the Ministry of Agriculture. You've got another concession with the Forestry Department. And this is, again, a big problem or a big challenge within all developing country contexts. And they don't talk to each other. Maybe that's strategic or not, I don't know, but they don't talk to each other. And you have to clean that all up before you can declare truly that it is a REDD site and it is a community forestry site.
Other thing, part of the project feasibility was getting the communities to understand what REDD is, and that's been a pretty big challenge, because the idea that foreign markets would be interested in the community's protection of the forest in that area was a very new concept to them. So we did a lot of workshops with about 50 different villages to try to introduce this concept to them, which they eventually understood as selling oxygen. We also had to do community consultations, so that was I think a model that could be used for other areas, where we were able to take the project document, which is a very technical, complicated, quite dense document, and try to make it understandable to local community leaders. And generally, all of the communities are very supportive of this project. They're very hopeful that it will contribute to their living standards, and they're relatively confident that they'll be able to control these drivers of deforestation. They're constantly going out on patrols, nighttime, daytime, up to 20, 30 people per patrol. So, we've done a lot of work collecting baseline data in cooperation with our partner, Terra Global Capital. Our teams went out in the field and measured trees in about 164 forest plots. And that was really tough work in the evergreen forest especially. So we're glad to have all of that data now completed, and it's in the final calculations now for the project document. The project design document, we helped to draft that with Terra Global Capital, and they were our technical partner for the methodology. And now we're at just the stage of number 7, the validation of the methodology, which is a lot of back and forth with the company in Germany called Tilsud, who's been contracted to review the methodology, and they find issues, and we have to make new justifications for them. So after that's completed, we'll be looking at certification, registration of the carbon credits, working on identifying a buyer, if you know anyone, please. And also looking at the emissions reduction purchase agreement. So this is the legal agreement between the seller, the government of Cambodia, the Forestry Administration, and the company or investor. So that will be a long-term agreement, and there are lots of issues that we need to work out there, like where will the dispute resolution take place, and what's confidential, what's not, and what is the liability. We're also looking at the revenue distribution mechanism. So exactly how those revenues will reach to the local community. Will it be a trust fund, or a grants mechanism, or will it be cash payments to the families in the villages? There's lots of different options, so we're looking at that now. And then also the monitoring, reporting, and verification, or MRV. This is the system that needs to be set up to report to these standard-setting organizations, the CCB and the VCS. And right now, I think we have about 65 indicators or so that they would like us to track in collaboration with the communities. So it's an employment opportunity if we involve the communities, but it's also going to be a big challenge to get the capacity to the level where they're able to collect this information and deliver it to the VCS and the CCB. So yeah, PACT is playing a very active role in working with the communities, with the Forestry Administration, all the other stakeholders to try to make this project successful. Going back.
Okay. One of the things that I think is important here, just going back a couple of slides, this is pegged to be one of the first community forestry REDD projects. It'll be validated by the voluntary carbon standard, which is a very monumental milestone that will happen. Secondly, that is one of the first bundled approaches to REDD. Now, if you think of community forestry, for those of you who are familiar with community forestry is not usually contiguous. You don't have one big piece of land that's being managed by communities. You have actually much more like this, a mosaic, where you've got little pieces here and there throughout the landscape. And those are managed by community forests. So this is a methodology which allows you to work in a non-contiguous landscape and still be able to do a REDD project. That's what's revolutionary about this particular methodology. That's why there's a lot of organizations that are interested in getting this methodology passed through the VCS and the CCB, because it's going to open up a lot of opportunities throughout the world for community forests and REDD, because most of the community forests are not contiguous areas. I think is important. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. All right, I think we've been through most of this. We've already put our project document with the CCB. The only thing that I would add to that is these two mechanisms, international mechanisms, which are fairly well established and recognized as, if you want to get as close as you can to the compliance market within REDD, you should be getting your methodology validated by CCB as well as VCS. What's the difference between these two? CCB, Climate Community Biodiversity Alliance, well, it's in the name. What are they looking at? They're looking at what's the impact on communities regarding REDD, and then what's the impact on biodiversity. Looking at those mainly. VCS, Voluntary Carbon Standard, it's in the name. They're looking at the science behind how you're measuring carbon. Is the methodology you're using a correct methodology to be able to say how much carbon units is coming out of that particular landscape? Within the CCB, this is just one example of how complex this can be, but how you can involve communities at the local level. CCB, you submit your project document. It goes online. It's a public document. If I had access to the internet, I'd actually pop in there. You can find our document in there. They allow for a 30-day public consultation period on that, any document that is public, that goes onto the CCB site. Now, if you happen to be a core community person at the local level that is managing a community forest, and this project, a REDD project, is going to fundamentally change your life, are you going to be able to have public, access to internet to make, comments on this project document, let alone all the language barriers that go with it? So what PAC did, and I think it's one of the first ones in the world, is we made the extra step to get back out there to the communities during that 30-day period, to boil that project document down into very easily understandable sound bites, and got comments back from the community. And if you go onto that website, next to our project document, you'll also see, you can click on public consultation. In there, you can see that there's a document and all the feedback that the communities gave on this particular project. Some good, some not good. We were being honest on this one. But I think it sets a different standard regarding that public consultation. It's not just about us as scientists getting access. We want communities to get access to that public consultation as well. Let me see. I want to move quickly through this at this point. What is interesting to note here, this gets a little bit technical, the project baseline, or the project start date, was 2 years ago. It was more than 2 years ago. It was January 2008. You can get validated any time you want, but the verification doesn't happen until 2 years after you've actually started the project, your baseline on the project. The verification is doing what? Validation is saying your methodology is valid, basically. The verification is saying, okay, you said that you were going to be producing 2 million metric tons of carbon over the past, during a 2-year period. This goes after that 2-year period and actually does that measurement by satellite, by getting on the ground. It makes that calculation. Well, was it 2 million or was it 1.5? Or perhaps it was 2.5. So the verification happens 2 years after. That's the point at which you actually know exactly how much carbon credit you have or have had, and therefore exactly how much you can sell in the market. Not to say you can sell it before in a pre-sale, but I just wanted to highlight that. Quickly, I'm not going to go through a lot of this because I want to get to some questions, and we've taken up a lot of your time. But roles of stakeholders within this particular program, community forests sit at the very center of the stakeholders. And you can see a list of all the different activities regarding REDD which they are currently involved in. And will be involved in revenue and distribution mechanisms. Because again, for PACT, communities that sit at the center, we want the communities not just to be acting with those revenues as revenue managers at the local level, but also as watchdog organizations. Because if it's flowing through, the money will always flow through other entities before it gets to communities. And so the communities should have a right to be able to make sure that what should be getting to them is getting to them. So they have two roles. One is a watchdog role, the other is a actual fund management role. The Forestry Administration, this is what forestry administrations do or should be doing well throughout the world. In this case, what's unique about Cambodia is that they are the seller of carbon, and so they're the ones that are making the deal with the buyer. Not to say that we'll be involved, and Terra Global will be involved in that. Amanda and I have already talked about what is PACT doing regarding all of this. I mean, we're on the ground. We're mobilizing community forest groups. We're getting them registered. We're helping them to get land tenure. We're doing some of the measurements on the ground. We're working with the Forestry Administration regarding defining this revenue distribution mechanism. We're basically managing a lot of, or coordinating a lot of these stakeholders. Terra Global is here. Sylvia is here. I just wanted to give her a chance quickly to go through some of the roles that Terra Global is doing as a carbon developer.
Okay, well, Kurt's walked you. My name is Sylvia Tagnetti, and I work with Terra Global Capital, which is based in San Francisco, but there's two of us here in Washington. Kurt has walked you through the steps in the carbon development process, so I'm not going to go through all of those again. I just wanted to maybe say a few words about the methodology. Besides, we were brought in as a lead partner to support the carbon development process, which has several components. Marketing credits is just a small last step. What you saw was a very complex process, from feasibility assessment to preparing the project document, managing the validation process, and then managing the verification process, which happens every 2 years, and then the project document includes setting up standard operating procedures for measuring the biomass. It means developing a methodology unless there is already an adequate one. And I want to focus on the methodology because as Kurt said, it's the first one to be submitted for this project type for REDD. And in addition to what he said about bundling different sites, it's for a mosaic project type, which means that it's broadly applicable to mosaic is an unplanned deforestation type where you have multiple drivers and then multiple types of project actions that you use to reduce those drivers of deforestation. And it will be broadly applicable to mosaic project types throughout Southeast Asia. As he said, or Amanda said, the first validation is almost finished, and we expect the second one to go a little bit faster, and to be able to submit the project document shortly after that. And I just want to give a little bit of credit to Community Forestry International. They've initiated the project, but they pulled back from Cambodia for reasons unrelated to the project, and in fact became the implementing organization. But Terra has relied very much on both CFI and PACT for the much of the in-country knowledge and on-the-ground work, especially Amanda and I. And if you have more questions about them, last time Kurt did this presentation, a lot of questions came up about how the methodology addressed leakage. And so if you have questions about that, maybe I can talk about that more in the question and answer period.
Great. Quickly running through some of the challenges. I'm not going to go through these. What I really wanted to talk about is the governance challenges. Let's never underestimate that REDD is only going to be as successful as the governance structures that exist within REDD and in a country. Most of the major forests that are left in the world happen to be in some of the most corrupt and conflict-ridden countries in the world. So you look at DRC, you look at Burma, Cambodia, you have 58%. These happen to be some of the most corrupt, according to Transparency International countries. So there's going to be a direct link between addressing governance issues, along with community forestry, along with REDD. It's not just about trees. It's not just about the science. There's a whole social science that goes on behind this, which if we don't address, we are going to fail in terms of community forestry playing a critical role for reducing or addressing carbon emissions. I'm going to stop here because I would like to do a 6-minute video which will take you to Cambodia, and it will be your virtual dirt under your fingernails.
As the world community begins to tackle the issue of global warming with renewed seriousness, increasing focus is being turned to the role forests play in the future of the planet. Deforestation is responsible for 17% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions, making it the developing world's largest contributor to global warming. This puts Southeast Asia on the front lines of the climate change battle. Cambodia currently has one of the highest proportions of forest covers in the region, with 59% of the country's surface area covered by trees. But demands for timber and agriculture are placing the country's forests under extreme pressure. Nowhere are these pressures more apparent than in the northwest of the country, which has been losing over 2% of its forest cover every year. Without stops to halt this trend, the region will lose more than a third of its forests in 20 years. And if a healthy forest system is important for the planet, it is critical for the communities that live near the forest. To help combat deforestation, the Royal Government of Cambodia's Forestry Administration and its development partners have implemented REDD, a groundbreaking program that puts disadvantaged communities at the forefront of the conservation effort. REDD, for reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, is a UN-endorsed mechanism which enables developed countries to financially compensate developing nations for sustainably managing their forests. In Cambodia, this starts with assisting 13 communities in Oda Mian Che province to protect their forests, while also enabling them to use the forest's resources to support their livelihoods. The government has granted these communities with the right to sustainably manage almost 68,000 hectares of forest. The project will then sell the carbon sequestered. The revenue generated from the sale of these credits will then return to the communities to help improve their economic circumstances. These funds will make tangible contributions to the quality of life in the communities and a demonstrable difference in their ability to protect the forests. The communities and the Forestry Administration establish the boundaries of their community forest and conduct patrols to prevent encroachment and illegal logging. This is one of the world's first REDD projects to link core communities with the private sector to address the planet's most pressing issues, poverty and climate change. The project also promotes the enhanced use of non-timber forest products for sustainable income generation opportunities. By encouraging improved methods of harvesting and marketing these products, the project helps improve their profitability. But the forest means more to the villagers than a source of income. There is also a spiritual connection between the people and their forests. This is the first REDD project to harness the community's passion to protect their forests.
ឆ្នាំ2008នេះបានប្រកាសរបស់ក្រសួងកសិកម្មមកដាក់ព្រៃដើម្បីប្រគល់ព្រៃនេះឲ្យមកថ្មថែហើយដោយគ្នាមកដល់នេះមានកិច្ចព្រមព្រៀងជាមួយរដ្ឋាភិបាលជាមួយនឹងអង្គការ PEG ដើម្បីដាក់គម្រោងកាបូនចូលមកក្នុងព្រៃនេះទៀតនេះជាចំណុចសំខាន់មួយណាដែលអាត្មារងចាំយូរហើយបង
As the project gains momentum, its sponsors aim to significantly expand its scope.
ហើយយើងបានមានគោលដៅដើម្បីបង្កើតសហគមន៍ព្រៃឈើហ្នឹងឲ្យបានច្រើនទៅតាមតម្រូវការនិងតាមស្ថានភាពជាក់ស្ដែងអាចមានដល់ទៅប្រមាណ2លានហិកតា
By recognizing and enabling the community's role in sustainably managing some of the world's most precious carbon resources, REDD puts Cambodia at the cutting edge of the climate change movement. REDD links 3 vital actors: the government, the private sector and the community, to build a more sustainable future for the forests and for the planet.
Okay, I just have 2 comments on that video. First is you saw a very powerful figure in Cambodia, His Excellency Tisakon, who is the director of the Forestry Administration up until 3 weeks ago. And he has been in that position for years, I think 15 years or so, a very long time. Extremely powerful within the Cambodia political scene. He was fired from his job by the Prime Minister because he was illegally logging and selling logs over to Vietnam. Now I say that because I think that's important. It's important that you have one of the most powerful figures in the forestry service in that country that now does not have their job. That does say something about the change in the political will that's happening in Cambodia. Secondly, we think that the carbon economy and our ability to fight against climate change is going to take all sorts of high-tech tools to get us there. And I brought some of these weapons with me, which include tape measure for trees. How big are they? So you can start to measure, what is the carbon resource within those trees. Something for measuring the canopy. So again, tells you something about how much carbon resources happen to be there. Of course, you got to know where you are in the forest is. That's a compass. And I'm sure many of you who are foresters will recognize this baby. Tree tags, although we make them out of beer cans, recycled beer cans in Cambodia, because the real things get stolen by villagers because they look like coins. And you can make necklaces out of them. You can do all sorts of things with tree tags. So that's a local technology where we've made a solution. And a GPS. And if you were able to see, there was a monk in the video that was holding this. We have these tools or weapons against climate change in the hands of communities themselves. We teach them how to use these. We teach them how to measure their own biodiversity and their own biomass, which means that they will play a fundamental role in the future regarding monitoring, reporting, and validation and verification of carbon resources. So I'm going to stop there. I want to say thank you very much for inviting us. And Darcy was actually out there in the outbacks of Cambodia and got to see some of these community forestry groups. Any questions?
First of all, I want to just quickly add, thank you, excellent presentation. And when you're asking your questions, please just, if you don't mind, quickly say your name and who you're with. And also, if you have to duck out now after the presentation, don't feel embarrassed, that's fine, but we do own this room, so we'll stay and have Q&A now.
Okay. Please.
Hi, Jill Loftus with the Nature Conservancy. Thanks for your presentation. I did know a bit about this project a bit earlier because I had several conversations with Mark Pfaffenberger as it was starting up, so really great to see it's at this level.
Mark Pfaffenberger is the president of Community Forestry International, and a great activist when it comes to community forestry issues globally. Please.
So just a couple questions. You said that you were in the stage now of looking at the benefit distribution mechanisms, and so I'm wondering if there are stipulations at government level in Cambodia on either percentages, or you're free to select from a series of options if you actually discuss those with communities. So a little bit deeper dive into what that is and what you're looking at, what the parameters are. Because we're also discussing the same thing. We're developing a pilot in Indonesia that I'm working on right now.
Right.
And so my second question is just on Indonesia. That and other sorts of community forestry initiatives, they've been a little bit problematic in some parts of Indonesia, and so I'd love to hear more about your positive experiences. I'm still making my way through the Aceh 10-year study right now on REDD and local communities, so if you have more to share on that, also would welcome that. Thank you.
For the revenue distribution mechanism, what is once the buyer gives the money, where does it go, and how does it get distributed, and who gets what in that, and how does it eventually make it to communities at the local level? I think a lot of this will depend upon how much money is flowing through the system, of course. I think it's difficult to create a revenue distribution mechanism, a really fully flushed out one, without knowing exactly how much revenues there will be. Because, of course, if you're selling 7 million metric tons at $25, there's going to be a lot more money available at the local level outside of just community forestry management, sustainable management of these forests. Then you'll open up the opportunity to talk about development issues within these communities, because there's going to be extra money that's left over. If you're selling at only $5 a metric ton, well, then you're probably only designing a revenue distribution mechanism, which is just going to make sure that these carbon resources are sequestered and that the communities are actually managing them. So there's an issue there, I think, regarding exactly how much and then how robust that revenue distribution mechanism. Regarding the legal framework in Cambodia, there's a directive that was signed by the Prime Minister that says that the majority of the income from carbon has to make it to communities at the local level. And they put it into 3 areas. One was livelihoods. Second was expansion of new REDD project areas. And what was the third one?
Improving forest quality.
Okay, improving forest quality. So there is actually some framework in the country. That said, no, the details on all of the players and what exactly they get along the way has not been worked out. The Forestry Administration will get a chunk, and they should get a chunk. They're out there and they're supposed to be doing the enforcement of the forestry law. But PACT, what is our passion? Our passion is the steward in the middle to make sure that those resources, as much as possible, make it to communities at the local level, either through the project management. So as Amanda was saying, employment for people to actually do the management of the project and manage those funds. And secondly, if there's money left over, of course, all that great development stuff that you can do through participatory development methods. Your second one, I think this is an example of that. I think we'd be happy to go more in deeper details, but I want to give other people some chances to ask questions. Go ahead.
Oh, hi, I'm Diane Russell with USAID's Biodiversity and Forestry team, and I had a couple of questions about both the benefits and the costs. In terms of the benefits, I was wondering, I'd like to get your perception on the benefit of having clarification of land tenure and property rights in itself as part of this process, and if that, if that's something that, that makes it almost worth doing, even if the market isn't great. Biodiversity benefits, I didn't hear much about that either, but maybe you can clarify that. And then on the costs, have you really costed out the involvement of PACT, Terra Global, all the other actors in this? Because one of the concerns we have in USAID is that just, when is is it financially sustainable over the long term? When do you sort of break even in the process?
Right. All great questions. And I didn't mention the benefits on the biodiversity benefits. As part of CCB, you have to do a biodiversity assessment.
Yeah.
It's part of the criteria for getting your project validated under the CCB. It is not proof of concept yet, but there are projections that if you can find endangered species, flora and fauna, within that landscape or within that REDD project, that you have the potential to have an increase of 20% of carbon revenues, because then it pops into what's called premium carbon. And there will be buyers out there that will value biodiversity. Cathay Pacific, you're sitting on their plane, the TV drops down, and what are they going to say? They're going to say, we're saving forests in Cambodia as well as tigers, if there happen to be some tigers there. So there might be a market for biodiversity. The first one, you are absolutely right, smack in terms of that one. The communities, what do they value right now? There isn't a dollar that's made it to communities at the local level yet. But what they truly value is that they have land tenure. It's extremely important to them. That's their livelihoods. And they are so excited about getting that legal document that I think we bought some time. And I don't know how much longer we have bought that time for, but that's your quick and early win to a much more lengthy process, which is going through this REDD stuff and getting revenues. But no, PACT is in it not just for REDD, we're in it for the community forest, and we will move forward with community forest as one of our pillars, not just community forest, because I think that's a huge problem globally. And then lastly, oh sorry, you're getting to see my trip to Spain. Sorry, what was your last question? Oh, the cost-benefit stuff. Good question. Right now, I think we don't know what is the economy of scale needed to be able to balance off that project development costs and then the revenues that are coming in. I would say we are at the razor edge with this site. 68,000 in the projections of the biomass that's there and the carbon. We are lucky if we're going to sort of break even in terms of the cost it will take villagers and the government and whoever's involved in that to actually manage it on an annual basis. And the revenues that are coming in, it's about at the break even for this site. So I think there's a discussion that needs to be made is what is the economy of scale you need within certain landscapes in order for it to be economically viable. And then I think there's a huge role that donors, can play, and I hate to say this because it's not particularly advantageous for me as an NGO to say this, but I believe it. In terms of making sure that any ODA that's coming in, which there will be, donor assistance, and there has to be. It's a new industry. There's a lot of risks in the market. It's going to be a hybrid market where the private sector is not going to be investing immediately, or if they are, it's just going to be low risk investments for them. So that means that donors are going to play an important role to kickstart this industry, as they have with the computer industry and the space industry and so on and so forth. And then it will move to a private sector approach. But I would say there's big mistakes that are being made by donors right now. I'll give you one example. In Indonesia, I won't say who the donor is, it's not USAID. So. There is one donor that within the landscape has put $30 million on the table for 100,000 hectares. Now this is 68,000 hectares here. So we're getting close to 100,000 hectares. And I think up to date, we probably spent about $500,000 to get it to the market. So there's a huge difference between $500,000, so did I say $500,000 compared to $30 million. whatever is going on in that project in Indonesia is economically not sustainable. And this donor is going to be the laughing stock of the REDD development field. So I think there's an important role that donors play in trying to calculate how much is enough, so that we don't basically subsidize it so much that the private sector is going to look at a project and say, there's no way I'm going to invest in that project. So those are three great questions. Yes, sorry.
Yeah, I'm with the Jane Goodall Institute,
Right.
and we just started two event preparedness projects for the community.
Yep.
And I'm so grateful. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and sharing your experience. We also started with win-win approaches such as dealing with land tenure, also in Tanzania, and can be used in more sense in GIS. Trying to use Android mobile phones by Google,
right,
which are a little bit, they also have GPS, but they're a little bit streamlining the data flow. But the challenge which we have right now is that we have all these methodologies, Woods Hole, whatever, to do the measurements and to teach the community and to start building the capacity. But we still don't have an agreement in the country what the standards are. And in Tanzania, they're trying to develop country-wide standards. So at what extent, in your experience in these countries, you had to wait for the country kind of go ahead with certain methodologies versus just as long as they ratify at the international level, then you felt that it's safe enough to start building the capacity of the community?
For me, the most important thing if you go the community forestry route, and even if you don't, the most important regulation you can have in the country is land tenure. Number one. If you don't have land tenure, then you shouldn't be doing it's not clear, you shouldn't be doing a REDD project in that country. When it comes to governments defining what the methodology is, that's not important. You can actually get a internationally approved, or not internationally, within the market of the VCS and the CCB, you can get a methodology approved which is valid and which buyers will find attractive and they will purchase. So that national level methodology, while I think it's important, it's not necessary. Also, I think there's a risk right now within REDD that everybody's excited about the policies and the procedures and the regulations and the methodologies and so on and so forth. And there is a risk here that before we even get $1 into villagers' hands, we have policied and regulated us out of business in REDD. And I kin it to the microfinance, because I worked in the microfinance sector. The microfinance sector was a huge industry now, and dealing with the poverty alleviation. It took 15 years of all these pilots going on out there, at the local level, to eventually pop up into policy, microfinance policy and regulations. And I'm a bit afraid we're doing this a little bit backwards. Projects should inform policy, not policy inform projects, because if you don't have projects, what type of policy are you making? You might be actually making policies which are not conducive to the growth of REDD. So I think we're in a little bit of a danger point here where everybody's excited about having all these policies in place, and I think it might lead to some really bad policies in some of these countries, which will mean that REDD will not be able to take off. I'm all for let's get projects on the ground and running that then inform what are the best practices and the lessons learned regarding REDD, which then feed into policies. So that's a personal opinion. Maybe Patrick agrees with me. Yeah, I'll take 2 more questions and then one back here and one there.
All right, Chris Meyer from Marlow Defense Fund.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. I agree with what you say there, that we need to get some pilots going on so we can inform the policy. Local institutions, are they already in place? You say it sounds like you had to set up a community forestry group. Is this just political, or is there actually also a business connected to it that will be helping generate these other income sources? And then you talked about, you haven't really sorted out the benefit distribution yet. Is there a guaranteed amount that they signed up for when they sold these, they give away their carbon? Or actually, sorry, the government owns the carbon, but are they guaranteed a certain amount for all these? It sounds like they're already patrolling. How's that working out?
Yeah, there is, I fully support that you should look at indigenous already existing social institutions before you create something new. So you'll see smack in the middle of that site, the largest community forestry site in that province is the big red stuff in the middle, the site in the middle. That's the Monk's Forest. And that has been there for a very long time. So there are some indigenous structures. Tap into them, use them as much as possible. And then, of course, there's not going to be structures in place, but there might be a women's, nutrition group, or there might be a waters user group. There are other types of social structures that are not community forestry that can also be a place to tap into. Our approach is very simple on this one. We go in, we educate a village, and we say, here are some benefits from community forestry, because our entry point is community forestry, not REDD. It's trying to get a new village to understand what REDD is. It's the community forestry approach. And we walk away, and we say, you call us. If you're in, we don't have we're going to say, we're going to, come hell or high water, we're going to have 15, or 25 community forestry groups in this province. We walk away, we say, you call us. It needs to be demand driven. And sure enough, we have actually more demand to establish community forestry groups than we have funding for. So it's a very demand driven approach. And your last question was?
Is there a set amount that they know they're going to get, or who's paying these patrols? It's just all volunteer right now.
There isn't.
They're still excited about getting
They're excited about their land tenure, and because we actually don't know how much money is flowing through. And is it going to be $5, $10, $25? It would be very dangerous to sign something that says this community is going to get a certain amount of money when you don't actually know how much money is there. There's some liability issues. One more question.
Yes, I'm Leo Bolter from the World Wildlife Fund. I just have a question about your REDD methodology and precisely about how you set your reference levels for deforestation. And obviously, inevitably, how are you monitoring leakage?
Yeah, our reference level is the province. And because in the case of Cambodia, there's good historical data on deforestation rates, we've chosen the province, which is 2% per year, as the reference point. And then we will measure that against future provincial and then what's going on in these forestry groups. So that's the reference point. You choose it, you hope you got it right. We chose this one because we have access to data on that. For the leakage, she could probably do a half-day session on leakage.
We put a few slides in reserve on there, but I could just be brief and say that what we do is distinguish the drivers that are geographically constrained from the ones that are unconstrained. And by geographically constrained, I mean fuel wood collection and conversion to cropland by the communities, forest fires induced by the communities, or logging for local and domestic use. And so there would be a maximum distance at which you would expect those drivers to be in effect. And then you have the unconstrained ones would be fires induced by migrants, or conversion by migrants, or illegal logging. And so then for the constrained ones, you can establish a leakage belt. And you can monitor deforestation in the leakage belt and subtract the amount that can be attributed to leakage. For the unconstrained ones, you have to well, first let me say, for both of them, you do what's called a sorry, the word got away from me. It's called a factor approach, and you get information from rural appraisals and expert knowledge. You do that for both, and then for the geographically constrained drivers, you can then measure afterwards. And the leakage belt is, looks at distance traveled. It has something called a cost distance map. There's only so far you're going to walk to get firewood. You may use vehicles depending on the cost. There's the cost of transportation, the time involved. And then for the constrained drivers, you just have to use in the AFLU guidance provided by the Voluntary Carbon Standard, there's some factors that they recommend using for example, there's a factor of 70% used for illegal logging, which is conservative. You have to use conservative estimates for the unconstrained drivers because you can't measure it. And then, of course, you have to account for all the increases of emissions associated with leakage prevention activities. And by that, I mean, if you have intensified agriculture outside the forest, you have to count the increased fertilizer use, the rice production, and manure management.
We're so glad that Terra Global's doing that. You know, and it goes to another point is I think there's also a danger that a lot of organizations within that whole value chain from community forests to Wall Street purchasing carbon, there's going to be organizations that are going to try to fill in that whole value chain and say we can do everything, and I think that's a big mistake. There's some great partners out there that you can leverage, and you don't have to duplicate already existing organizations. Our heart as an institution is clearly, with those communities at the local level, and also with addressing climate change. And again, we see communities and community forests at the center of that approach, addressing a huge, complex global issue. And it's great that we have found something that poor communities can do at the local level to address this global issue. So thank you. You've been a great audience. And thank you to the Forestry Service for inviting us.
Thank you.